In the shadowed hills of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to the valleys as though time itself had forgotten them, there exists a mystery that has haunted historians for nearly 2 centuries. The year was 1834 when the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 2 young twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a community so isolated that even the maps of that era scarcely acknowledged its existence. What unfolded during their 3-day stay in that secluded settlement was something no one could have predicted, and something that would become a mystery that defied all logic and explanation. The arrival of the Morrison family in Pine Hollow was not an ordinary event. The town, small and largely disconnected from the outside world, had been accustomed to the visits of traveling preachers, yet nothing could prepare the townsfolk for what would happen once the Morrison twins stepped into their midst. The twins, at the tender age of 9, were like no other children the community had ever seen. Their eyes, despite their youth, carried a depth and intensity far beyond their years. Their father, Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, was a preacher known for his powerful sermons and his ability to bring spiritual renewal to the most forsaken communities. Yet, it wasn't his sermons that would captivate the people of Pine Hollow. It was the strange and unnerving abilities of his daughters. When the Morrison family arrived, the first thing the townspeople noticed was the exhaustion etched on their faces. The twins, though weary, seemed strangely alert, as though they were seeing beyond the physical world. As they sat down to a simple meal with the town's pastor, William Phillips, it was Rebecca, the more outgoing twin, who first broke the unsettling silence. She casually asked Mrs. Phillips about the roses in her garden, specifically asking whether the blight that had destroyed them 3 summers ago had been dealt with. The question was not only perplexing. Mrs. Phillips had never shared this personal detail with anyone outside of her closest friends, but it was also an indication that Rebecca knew something she could not possibly have known. This was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the twins would reveal secrets about the townspeople. Secrets so accurate and so specific that they sent a chill down the spines of everyone they spoke to. The twins spoke of things that had happened long before their birth. Things no child, let alone one so young, could have known. And yet, every word they spoke was verifiably true. They spoke of events that no one else had ever spoken of, describing people and places with unnerving precision. What made it even more unsettling was that the twins had no way of knowing these details. They hadn't been told, nor had they read it in books. The knowledge seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere beyond natural comprehension. For the people of Pine Hollow, these revelations were more than just curious, they were terrifying. The question that lingered in their minds was one that no one could answer. How could 2 9-year-old children possess knowledge that even the most seasoned adults couldn't explain? It wasn't a gift of intelligence. It was something much darker, something that would send the people of Pine Hollow on a path to uncovering truths they were never meant to know. The Kentucky of 1834 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in near isolation among the rugged Cumberland foothills. The settlers here sought refuge from the hustle and bustle of more populous areas, yearning for a simpler life far removed from the conflicts and complexities of urban life. Pine Hollow, founded in 1818, was a small, tight-knit community of just over 200 souls, most of them related by blood or marriage. The town had been established by families seeking religious freedom, away from the denominational conflicts that raged in the larger settlements. But despite the peaceful exterior, Pine Hollow was a place where the past lingered and secrets festered in the shadows of the hills. It was into this remote and insular world that the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived one autumn evening. The journey had been long and treacherous. The late fall rains had turned the mountain paths into thick, treacherous mud. Ezekiel had carried Rachel for the final miles when she had fallen ill with a fever. Their mother had died giving birth to the twins during a fierce winter storm, and Ezekiel had raised them on his own ever since, with little help from the outside world. The sight of his daughters, both so strikingly identical yet so different in their temperaments, was a reminder of his grief. Rebecca, the older by mere minutes, had always been the more outgoing of the two. Her smile was infectious, and she spoke with a confidence far beyond her years. Rachel, on the other hand, was quieter and more reserved. She often observed the world from the shadows of her more exuberant sister, yet those who looked closely could see that Rachel was just as perceptive, if not more so. Their arrival in Pine Hollow was not an ordinary one. The town had seen its fair share of preachers passing through, traveling ministers who came and went, their stays brief but usually fruitful. But there was something different about the Morrison family from the very beginning. The people of Pine Hollow couldn't quite put their finger on it, but there was an undeniable aura about the twins. They weren't like other children. They seemed to know more than they should, and it unsettled everyone they encountered. They carried a certain gravity that others couldn't ignore, an almost unsettling awareness in their eyes, as if they could see beyond the world that most people understood. When they arrived at the Phillips household, the community pastor's home, it was nearing evening. Pastor William Phillips had just concluded his nightly prayers with a small group of devout congregants who attended the Wednesday evening service. He had long been accustomed to receiving visiting preachers and travelers, but Ezekiel Morrison and his daughters left an impression on him that he would not soon forget. Ezekiel's weathered face and prematurely graying hair suggested years of hardship, yet his eyes revealed a man whose spiritual conviction had not wavered in the face of adversity. His daughters, though tired from the journey, possessed a quiet, unsettling awareness that unsettled Phillips. Even at such a young age, their presence was commanding. As the Morrison family settled in for a simple supper, it was Rebecca who first broke the uncomfortable silence. She asked Mrs. Phillips about the roses in her garden, inquiring if the blight that had nearly killed them 3 summers ago had been overcome. Mrs. Phillips, taken aback by the question, dropped her spoon in surprise. She had never mentioned the blight to anyone outside of her closest friends. The roses were a personal treasure, and this child, a stranger to the town, could not have known about the past loss. But Rebecca, with a knowing smile, simply explained that she had dreamed of the roses during their journey and knew they had been among the finest in the county. Pastor Phillips recorded the incident in his journal that night, baffled by the girl's peculiar knowledge. He dismissed it at first as a strange coincidence. Perhaps the child had overheard someone mention the roses. But this was only the beginning. Over the next several days, Rebecca and Rachel would reveal things no one could explain. Secrets buried deep in the hearts of Pine Hollow's residents. Things that no child should know. Secrets that would forever change the way the community saw the Morrison family. As the days passed, the strange occurrences surrounding the Morrison twins grew more unsettling. What began as a peculiar observation about a rose garden quickly escalated into an array of events that no one could rationally explain. In a town where everyone knew each other's business, and where the church's weekly services were the main form of social gathering, the arrival of the Morrison family, and the unsettling behavior of the twins, began to ripple through Pine Hollow like a stone thrown into a still pond. It wasn't long before Rebecca's seemingly innocent question about the roses was overshadowed by something far more disturbing. One morning, as Pastor Phillips prepared for the Sunday service, Rebecca approached him with a solemn expression. Her eyes, as always, were wide and knowing, but today there was something different, something that made Philip's skin crawl. She looked up at him and asked, in a voice so calm it was almost eerie, "Pastor Phillips, do you have a secret you've been hiding beneath the floorboards of your church?" The question struck Phillips like a cold gust of wind. For a moment, he was speechless, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. No one outside his closest confidants knew of the bottle of whiskey hidden beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar. It was a relic of a moment of weakness from months prior, when he had struggled with temptation and failed to rid himself of the sinful bottle. But how could she possibly know this? No one knew, not even his wife. "Rebecca," he stammered, his voice betraying his unease. "What do you mean?" Rebecca's gaze never wavered, and her lips curled into a knowing smile. "I dreamed about it, Pastor Phillips. I saw the bottle wrapped in a blue baby blanket. I saw it underneath your floor." The room fell eerily silent. Pastor Phillips, his heart racing, excused himself abruptly and quickly left the room. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air, his mind struggling to grasp the full implications of what Rebecca had just said. His mind flashed to the night he had hidden the bottle, the night he had wrapped it in the baby blanket that belonged to his deceased son, who had died in infancy. It had been a reminder of his failures, both as a father and as a man of the cloth. But how could a child, a stranger, know such an intimate detail? In the days that followed, more strange incidents occurred, each one more inexplicable than the last. Rebecca and Rachel, when asked about their dreams, would describe in vivid detail places they had never visited and events they couldn't have known. The most unsettling of these dreams involved people. People whom they had never met, yet could describe with unsettling accuracy. One afternoon, as the twins were playing outside the church, they suddenly began speaking of the town's founder, Jacob Whitman, and his wife, Mary. They described them in such detail, down to the silver locket that Mary wore around her neck, that it sent shivers down the spines of those who overheard them. But it wasn't just these odd dreams that left people questioning the twins' abilities. One evening, as the congregation gathered for the midweek service, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, the prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the church. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice sweet but unsettling, "the money you've been taking from the collection plate, it isn't really stealing, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." Samuel Turner, a man who had always been admired for his charitable deeds, turned pale at her words. For months, he had been taking small amounts from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed investment. He had promised to pay it back once his financial situation improved, but the guilt had been eating away at him. The revelation, though startling, was not the only one. As the twins moved through the congregation, they continued to reveal deeply personal secrets, things that no one could have known. Rachel, in her quiet, almost passive way, would whisper to elderly Martha Whitfield, the widow who ran the town's small grocery store, "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in a farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere. That's why you keep the letters from him hidden away in your drawer." The elderly widow nearly fainted, as Rachel described the letters she had received over the years from her estranged husband, who had abandoned her and their children years ago. The truth, buried for so long, was now exposed by two 9-year-old girls. Each revelation, though made with the innocent simplicity of children, was so accurate and specific that it shook the very foundation of Pine Hollow. The twins weren't simply guessing. They were speaking with the knowledge of events and people that no one could have possibly shared with them. It wasn't just intuition or sharp observation. It was something far more unsettling. It was as if they were seeing the truth of people's lives, the hidden secrets that everyone tried so hard to bury. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in Pine Hollow had shifted from curiosity to fear. What was happening to these children? How could they possess knowledge that defied every natural law? Were they simply extraordinary children with an unusual gift? Or was there something darker at work? The community, once welcoming and tight-knit, now found itself questioning its most cherished beliefs, and the truth was something they were not prepared to face. As the week progressed, the people of Pine Hollow found themselves unable to escape the unsettling knowledge that the Morrison twins seemed to possess. What had begun as strange, seemingly innocent comments from two young girls slowly transformed into a full-scale unraveling of the town's secrets. Each day brought new revelations, and with each revelation, the fear within the small community grew. The seemingly supernatural knowledge of Rebecca and Rachel forced the townsfolk to confront truths they had long buried, truths that now threatened to destroy everything they believed in. The most disturbing part was the way the twins spoke of these secrets. Calmly, without emotion, and with an unsettling certainty that left no room for doubt. Rebecca, the more outgoing twin, had always been the first to speak. Her voice, although sweet and childlike, carried an authority that left no room for argument. It was as if the words she spoke weren't her own, but were being channeled from some otherworldly source. And Rachel, quiet and reserved as always, would speak only after her sister had finished. But when Rachel spoke, it was with an eerie precision, and the knowledge she shared was as startling as it was terrifying. On the second Sunday of the Morrison family's stay, Pastor Phillips found himself on edge as he prepared for his sermon. He had spent the entire week trying to rationalize the strange occurrences, but the events were growing harder to ignore. The twins had continued to reveal more and more secrets, things about the town that no one else could possibly have known. The knowledge was too specific, too detailed, to be anything other than supernatural. That morning, as Phillips was preparing to speak, Rebecca approached him once again, her face unusually serious. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her soft voice, "there's something hidden beneath your pulpit. It's not supposed to be there." Phillips froze, his heart skipping a beat. He had never told anyone about the small hidden compartment beneath the pulpit, where he kept a personal stash of old letters and mementos. They were remnants of his life before Pine Hollow, things he had wanted to forget. But how could Rebecca know? Before he could respond, Rachel appeared beside her sister, her expression unreadable. "It's a letter," she said softly. "A letter you've never read. It's from someone you once loved, someone who never came back." The words cut through Phillips like a knife. He knew exactly what she was referring to. A letter he had written years ago to a woman he had once loved, a woman he had left behind when he became a preacher. That letter had never been sent. He had burned it long ago, convinced that he had made the right choice in dedicating his life to the church. But now these children knew about it, about something so personal, so hidden, that it made him question everything he thought he knew about them. Throughout the service, Phillips struggled to concentrate. His mind was consumed by the twins' revelations, and the people of Pine Hollow, too, could hardly focus on the sermon. The atmosphere in the church had changed, and the once comfortable silence was now filled with tension. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting nervously toward the Morrison family. They had all heard the strange rumors, whispers about the twins' abilities, the way they seemed to know things no one else could. But no one had ever imagined it would go this far. When the service ended, and the congregation began to file out of the church, it was as if the floodgates had opened. Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, the prosperous farmer who had long been an influential figure in Pine Hollow. With a look that seemed almost too knowing for a child of her age, she placed a hand on his arm and said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." The words hit Samuel like a thunderclap. He turned pale, his face drained of color, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of shame. For months, he had been skimming from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed investment in a business venture. He had promised himself he would repay it once his situation improved, but the guilt had gnawed at him, and now, standing before Rebecca, he realized that the secret he had so carefully kept hidden had been laid bare. It was not just Samuel Turner who found his secrets exposed. As the twins made their way through the congregation, they continued to reveal the hidden lives of Pine Hollow's residents. To elderly Martha Whitfield, they whispered of her long-lost husband, who had abandoned her and their children many years ago, leaving behind a trail of lies about his supposed death in a farming accident. To Dr. Hayes, they spoke of patients who had died under his care, not because of his incompetence, but because he had failed to properly treat them. Each revelation was more damning than the last, and with every secret exposed, the air in the church seemed to grow heavier. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating the community with the weight of its collective guilt. For the first time in years, Pine Hollow was forced to confront the darkness that had long been hidden in its heart. The carefully maintained facade of respectability was crumbling, and with it, the lives of its residents were laid bare. The twins, through their innocent yet chillingly accurate words, had forced the town to look in the mirror and face the secrets it had kept for so long. The question now was no longer how the twins knew these things, but what, if anything, could be done to stop the truth from destroying the very foundations of Pine Hollow. The revelations that poured from the Morrison twins were unlike anything the townspeople of Pine Hollow had ever experienced. The small community had always been bound by secrets, some of them old, some of them buried so deep that they had almost been forgotten. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next: the truth about the Whitman family. The Whitman family had been among Pine Hollow's founding members. Jacob Whitman, a sturdy, hard-working man, had served as both the town's blacksmith and its unofficial leader. His wife, Mary, was known for her gentle nature and her skill with herbal remedies, and the couple's twin daughters, Hope and Faith, were the pride of the town. The girls, no more than 9 years old, had been bright, beautiful, and full of life. They sang in the church choir, helped their mother with the sick, and were adored by all who knew them. They were a picture of innocence, a symbol of Pine Hollow's purity and strength. But in 1818, a tragic fire consumed their family's home, and they were all presumed dead. The official story, recorded in the town's archives, stated that the Whitman family had perished in a house fire during a winter storm. The flames had spread quickly, and their remains had been found among the charred ruins of the house. The community had mourned, rebuilt, and moved on as frontier communities were forced to do. But what had truly happened that night, no one knew. And as the Morrison twins began to speak, it became clear that the official story had been a lie. The revelation began subtly, as all the others had. One evening, after the evening meal, Rebecca stood up and approached Pastor Phillips. Her blue eyes, usually so innocent, were now dark with something deeper. "Pastor Phillips," she said in a quiet, eerie voice, "the Whitman family didn't die in that fire, did they?" Pastor Phillips froze, his hand still clutching his half-drunk glass of water. The words hung in the air like a cloud of dread, too heavy to dismiss. The townspeople, who had been listening in, turned toward the pastor, their faces reflecting confusion and alarm. They had always believed the Whitman tragedy to be just that, a tragedy, a fire, an accident. But now the child was saying something entirely different. Rebecca continued, her voice steady. "They died in the church, right here, behind the altar." The room was silent, save for the sound of the wind howling outside the church windows. Pastor Phillips could feel the blood draining from his face as he processed what Rebecca had said. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the truth that was now emerging with the reality he had lived for so long. The town had always believed that the fire had been an accident, a tragic end to a family that had been dear to them all. But what if they were wrong? What if something far darker had occurred? Before Phillips could respond, Rachel spoke, her voice soft but chilling. "They were hiding here," she said, nodding toward the altar. "Jacob and Mary were trying to protect their daughters. They knew someone was coming for them, and they ran to the church to find sanctuary." She paused, her expression unreadable. "But they didn't make it. They were found." Phillips felt his stomach twist in knots. His mind flashed back to the days when he had first arrived in Pine Hollow, when the town was still small and struggling. He had heard whispers, small hints, half-told stories about the Whitman family, but none of it had ever been confirmed. The town had moved on, but there were always lingering questions about the true nature of the Whitman family's death. As Rebecca and Rachel continued to speak, the townspeople began to murmur among themselves. Some were skeptical, dismissing the twins' words as the fanciful imaginings of children. But others, particularly the older members of the congregation, began to grow pale. They had heard rumors, too, rumors that had never been spoken aloud. Whispers of a confrontation between Jacob Whitman and several of the town's most prominent families. Rumors of corruption, theft, and lies. It had been said that Jacob had discovered something about certain members of the community. Something so terrible that it had threatened to destroy their reputations and ruin their livelihoods. He had made it clear that he was going to expose them, that he was going to take their sins to the authorities. But before he could, he and his family had died. Rebecca's next words sent a chill through the room. "It wasn't the fire that killed them," she said. "It was the people who came to silence them." She looked around the room at the gathered townsfolk. They were murdered and buried here, beneath the floor. The room fell into an eerie silence. Even the wind outside seemed to cease its howling, as though nature itself had paused to listen to the impossible truth being revealed. The truth about Pine Hollow's darkest secret. The truth about the murder of an entire family, covered up for years. The oldest member of the congregation, Elder Thompson, slowly rose to his feet. His weathered face was pale, and his hands trembled as he clutched the edge of his pew. He had been one of Pine Hollow's founding families, and his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally spoke. "Child," he said, his voice thick with years of suppressed guilt. "You speak of things that happened long before you were born. How could you know these things?" Rebecca's eyes locked onto his, her gaze unflinching. Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder, she said quietly. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her nightgown, because she had been ill with fever. The room gasped in shock. These were details only the town's oldest residents knew, details that had never been publicly discussed. The evidence was irrefutable. Elder Thompson's face crumpled with emotion. His voice, barely a whisper, cracked as he muttered, "It wasn't supposed to happen. We only meant to take the money. We were starving. Our children were sick. And winter was coming." He faltered, his eyes filling with tears. But Jacob wouldn't keep quiet. He threatened to expose us all. As the confession filled the room, the weight of Pine Hollow's sins seemed to press down on everyone in attendance. The truth about the Whitman family's murder was out, and the town could no longer hide behind its lies. The air in Pine Hollow had thickened with tension, and the weight of the twins' revelations was settling on the shoulders of every resident. The once tight-knit community, bound by secrets and unspoken truths, was now unraveling in front of their eyes. The murder of the Whitman family, once a mystery lost to the flames, had now come to light. The town was forced to confront not only the truth about the past, but the sins that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. Pastor Phillips had long prided himself on his ability to guide his congregation, to be the moral compass that kept Pine Hollow's heart in tune with God's will. But now, as the weight of the confessions pressed down on him, Phillips felt a deep sense of doubt. He stood before the congregation, struggling to find words that could address the immense guilt and shame that had descended on Pine Hollow. How could he preach forgiveness and redemption when the very foundation of their community was built on murder and lies? The revelation about the Whitman family had shaken the town to its core. The truth was now undeniable, but what would the community do with it? How could they move forward, knowing that they had been living a lie for so many years? As Philip stared out at the gathered faces, he saw fear in some, disbelief in others, and a deep, unspoken shame that seemed to hang over the congregation like a heavy fog. It was Elder Thompson who first broke the silence, his voice trembling as he stood before the crowd. His years of hiding the truth had finally taken their toll, and he could no longer carry the burden of guilt. I have done things that I cannot undo," he began, his hands shaking as he clutched the edge of the pulpit. Those of us who were involved, made a terrible mistake. We killed Jacob and his family. We didn't mean for it to happen, but when he threatened to expose our sins, we thought we had no choice. We were wrong." His confession, so raw and full of remorse, sent ripples through the congregation. Some turned away, unable to bear the weight of the words, while others remained still, listening in stunned silence. Elder Thompson's voice wavered as he continued. I regret it every day, but I can't undo what's been done. And now these children," he gestured to the Morrison twins, who stood quietly at the back of the room, their eyes fixed on the floor. "These children have brought the truth to light, the truth that we have tried to bury for so long." Phillips stepped forward, his heart heavy with the realization that the town could no longer hide from its past. "The truth is a heavy burden," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "and it will not be easy to carry. But we must face it, and we must make amends. We cannot continue to live in the shadow of these lies." The room was filled with murmurs, and a sense of unease spread like wildfire. The idea of facing the consequences of their actions, of confessing to crimes that had been buried for so many years, was almost too much to bear. But the twins, innocent as they were, had shown them that the truth could not be hidden forever. And now, the people of Pine Hollow were left with a choice: continue to hide, or confront the past and seek redemption. As Elder Thompson's confession hung in the air, the others who had been complicit in the murder began to speak. Samuel Bradford, one of the town's wealthiest landowners, rose from his seat, his face pale and strained. I didn't want to be a part of it," he said, his voice cracking. "But I was afraid. afraid of losing everything. We all were. But now I see how wrong we were. We killed an innocent family, and for that we must answer. One by one, the others who had been involved in the murder stood and confessed. There was no denying the truth now. It was as if the weight of their collective guilt had finally broken them, forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions. And as each confession was made, the community was forced to reckon with the truth that had been buried for so long. The twins stood quietly, their expressions unreadable. They had shown no sign of emotion as the confessions were made, but there was a quiet strength in their presence. They had come to Pine Hollow not as ordinary children, but as instruments of justice, tools through which the truth had been revealed. And though they were just 9 years old, they carried a burden far beyond their years. The knowledge of the past, the weight of the town's sins, was theirs to bear. The silence in the church grew heavy as the final confession was made. And then, as if on cue, Rebecca spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "The truth has come to light," she said softly. "But there is more to be done. The dead cannot rest until justice has been served, until the families of the victims receive the justice they deserve." Her words were simple, but they cut through the heart of the community like a knife. The truth was no longer a choice, it was a responsibility. The people of Pine Hollow had been living in the shadow of their sins for far too long, and now it was time to make things right. Pastor Phillips, his heart heavy but resolute, stepped forward. "We will make amends," he said, his voice steady and firm. "We will seek forgiveness for the wrongs we have done, and we will do everything in our power to make things right." The community was at a crossroads. They had been given the truth, but now they had to decide how they would move forward. Would they continue to hide, or would they seek redemption? Would they confront the consequences of their actions, or would they bury their guilt once again? The Morrison twins had shown them the way. The question now was whether Pine Hollow had the courage to follow it. As the confessions were made and the weight of Pine Hollow's sins began to settle into the hearts of its residents, the air around the town seemed to shift. The Morrison twins, despite their small stature, had brought forth a storm that no one could weather alone. Their innocent faces, devoid of malice yet filled with unnerving knowledge, had forced a community to face the buried truth. And now, with the revelations out in the open, it was time for the town to reckon with the consequences of their actions. The immediate aftermath was one of shock and disbelief. The townsfolk, most of whom had known each other for decades, struggled to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the dark secrets they had been keeping. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years now found themselves strangers, bound not by friendship, but by the shared guilt of a hidden crime. Many found themselves unable to look one another in the eye, unable to confront the people whose lives they had unknowingly been complicit in destroying. Rebecca and Rachel, though only 9 years old, seemed oddly unaffected by the chaos they had unleashed. They remained quiet, almost solemn, as though they had seen this all before. Like this was just another part of their strange journey. But it was not a journey they had chosen. They had been born with the knowledge of things beyond their years, forced to see the hidden sins of the world and speak the truth, no matter how painful. And now their purpose had been fulfilled. For the first time in the aftermath of the confessions, the town gathered in the same church where so many had heard their weekly sermons. But this was not a day of worship. It was a day of reckoning. Pastor Phillips had called the community together not for another sermon, but for a collective acknowledgement of their sins. The room was heavy with tension, the weight of the past pressing down on every person present. The air was thick with guilt, but also with the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long while, there was the possibility of redemption. But would the town be willing to embrace it? Pastor Phillips stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling as he looked out at the faces before him. He had spent the last few days in quiet contemplation, trying to find a way to lead his flock through this tumultuous time. But the truth was undeniable. The lies they had lived by had torn them apart, and no amount of prayer or good deeds could undo the damage that had been done. "The Lord is merciful," Pastor Phillips began, his voice trembling but steady. "But his mercy cannot exist in the absence of repentance. We have all sinned, and we have all failed to live the lives He intended for us. But the Lord does not abandon us. We must seek His forgiveness, and we must make things right." As he spoke, the townspeople listened in silence, their faces drawn with the pain of their confessions. Some bowed their heads in prayer, while others looked toward the Morrison twins, who stood quietly at the back of the room, their eyes fixed on the floor. It was as though they were waiting for something, as though they knew the next step in this painful journey. The truth had been revealed, but there was still much work to be done. The dead could not rest, not until justice had been served. Rachel, the quieter of the two, raised her eyes and spoke softly, her voice echoing through the church. "The truth is not enough," she said. "The past cannot be undone, but it can be acknowledged. The dead are still here, waiting for their justice. You must make amends. Only then can the spirits find peace." Her words were simple, but they struck like a thunderclap. The community had been so focused on confessing their sins, so consumed by their own guilt, that they had forgotten the most important thing: justice for the victims. The Whitman family, whose lives had been taken so brutally, deserved more than just the recognition of their deaths. They deserved the truth, but they also deserved reparation. Pine Hollow could no longer pretend that they had simply moved on. The sins of the past had not been erased. They were still living, breathing in the souls of the townsfolk. The first step toward making things right was a public apology. Not just to the Whitman family, but to the victims of every hidden crime. The townspeople had long known of the injustices that had taken place, but now it was time to admit their wrongdoings openly. Elder Thompson, who had once tried to bury the truth, was the first to speak. His voice was heavy with regret. "I failed you," he said, his voice breaking. "We all did, but I ask for your forgiveness. We took lives, we destroyed families, and we built our lives on lies. But we will make amends. We will do whatever it takes to make things right." One by one, the others spoke, each confessing not just their involvement in the murder of the Whitman family, but their complicity in the wrongdoings that had haunted Pine Hollow for years. They spoke of the lies they had told, the secrets they had kept, and the damage they had done. It was a long, painful process, but it was necessary. It was the only way the town could begin to heal. As the confessions came to an end, Rebecca and Rachel stepped forward. They had played their part, and now it was time for the town to carry the burden of its own redemption. The girls, with their eerie calm and knowing eyes, looked out over the congregation. "You must make amends," Rebecca said softly, her voice like a whisper of wind. "The truth has come. The rest is up to you." With those final words, the Morrison twins turned and left the church, their journey complete. The town of Pine Hollow was forever changed. The past had been revealed, but the work of healing was only just beginning. The truth had been set free, and it was now in the hands of the people to make sure it didn't destroy them. They had to choose whether to embrace redemption or be crushed by the weight of their guilt. For Pine Hollow, the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope, a hope born from the light of truth and the promise of redemption. As the last echoes of the Morrison twins' footsteps faded into the distance, Pine Hollow found itself at a crossroads. The truth had come to light, and with it, a reckoning had begun. The community, once bound by unspoken agreements and quiet complicity, now stood exposed in the harsh light of reality. But despite the shock, the guilt, and the shame that hung heavy in the air, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Hope that, through repentance, redemption might still be possible. The people of Pine Hollow had long been accustomed to living in the shadows, hiding their secrets beneath layers of faith and silence. But the Morrison twins, in their quiet, unsettling way, had shattered those illusions. They had shown the townsfolk that truth, no matter how painful, could not be suppressed forever. The dead, the Whitman family, the victims of greed and betrayal, had finally been given their voices. And the living, for the first time in years, had been forced to listen. But what now? Could the town truly heal from the wounds it had inflicted upon itself and others? The truth was that redemption was not a simple process. It wasn't something that could be achieved through words alone. It required actions, concrete, difficult actions that would prove the sincerity of the community's repentance. The first step was a public acknowledgement. The town, led by Pastor Phillips, gathered in the church once more to make a vow to the Whitman family's memory. They would build a memorial in their honor, a lasting symbol of their tragic deaths, but also a reminder of the cost of silence and complicity. The church would become a place of reflection, not just for worship, but for learning and atonement. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, a service would be held, not just for the Whitmans, but for all the forgotten victims of the town's sins. As for the Morrison twins, they had done what they came to do. Their task was not to remain in Pine Hollow and watch the town's painful journey toward redemption. It was to set the truth free. They had opened the door, and now it was up to the people to walk through it. They left the town as quietly as they had arrived, their purpose fulfilled, leaving behind a community forever changed by their presence. Pine Hollow would never be the same. The shadows that had once hung over the town were now filled with light, but it was a harsh light. The people would never forget the sins they had been forced to confront, nor would they forget the faces of the twins who had made them look. But perhaps, in time, they could come to accept that truth, painful as it was, had set them on a new path, one that would demand accountability, but also offer the possibility of redemption. For the first time in decades, Pine Hollow was free from its past. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had been acknowledged. The road to healing was long, and it was uncertain, but it was now a road they could walk together. As the sun began to set over Pine Hollow, casting long shadows over the land that had witnessed so much pain and healing, the story of the Morrison twins seemed to linger in the air. Their presence had been a catalyst for truth, and now, as the town slowly returned to its rhythm, a question remained. What would the rest of the world think of Pine Hollow's reckoning? Though the community had been forced to confront its past, it was not just for Pine Hollow alone. The story of the Morrison twins was a reminder, a warning, that the truth, however uncomfortable, must always be acknowledged. The road to redemption might be long, but it was worth traveling. Each town, each individual, must ask themselves, what secrets do we harbor? What are we willing to confront in the name of justice and honesty? If you are reading this now, take a moment to reflect on your own life, your own community. Do you live in the shadows of silence, where uncomfortable truths remain unspoken? Or do you stand ready to face whatever lies beneath, no matter how painful? Pine Hollow's story isn't just a tale of the past. It's a call to action for all of us, urging us to confront the injustices, the secrets, and the lies we may carry, no matter how deeply buried. The Morrison twins have shown us that the truth is never too dangerous to bring into the light. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is to acknowledge what has been hidden, to lay bare the past and begin the work of rebuilding. And while the road ahead will always be difficult, the first step toward redemption is always the hardest and the most important. So, as we reflect on the story of Pine Hollow, ask yourself, what truths must I face? What must I do to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated in my own life or the lives of those around me? The time to act is now. Let the story of the Morrison twins inspire us to seek the truth, embrace justice, and build a future free from the shadows of our hidden sins.